I'm Veronica and I went to Italy this summer. On my journey, I visited many wonderful places, including Florence, Rome, Ostia, Sorrento, and Capri. While exploring, I asked the question, how did the Catholic Renaissance affect modern comic books? Let's break this down. I define the Catholic Renaissance as between the 14th and 16th century of expansion of arts and architecture due to the Catholic Church's patronage, and comic books as any type of visual storytelling. While we were in Italy, we visited many churches, including the Baptistery, Trinta di Monti, the Vatican, Fonte dei Quattro Fumi, the Pantheon, and many more. A pretty common layout for the churches that we visited was to have one large main hall and two side halls. On the side halls, there are small vaults that acted as altars to specific religious figures and saints. In this picture, you can see what the vaults look like from the main hall. And this is the front where the priest would speak. And this is a portrait that you might find in one of the side vaults from the hall. All of these churches were extremely decorated with frescoes and sculpture. In this picture you can see just how decorative they got with paintings and gold. In this one you can see a lot more symbolism with the white dove, the gold ring, the lady, the book, the priest, and the old man, who represents the philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. In this one you can see how the story carries from the very top all the way down to the bottom. We see these stories everywhere if you look. The Pantheon has many small sculptures depicting the death of Christ. At the beginning of this video, you can identify the two small squares on either side of the statue of Mary. As the video moves around the room, you can see that the small squares pop up everywhere around the room. As you can kind of see them, they tend to be on either side of big statues. Because they're quite small, a lot of people don't realize that they're there, but if you actually look at them, they tell the entire story of Christ's death and rebirth. Not only are these very beautiful, but they're very practical too, as at the time, approximately 6% of the population were literate. Frescoes gave visual aid that depicted what people were hearing at church. Mostly these were just portraits or very important scenes that were painted, but as they became more and more popular and detailed and in larger demand, we start to see a change. This is a video from the Capitoline Museum, and in the video you can see there's a lot of these paintings, and if you look at them, you can see that they all sort of take place in the same scene, they are all within the same characters, and they all sort of show the same storyline. And this is where we're going to begin. Movement. Movement is very important because we see smaller, more fluent time jumps rather than these just key events. And this is a large step towards modern comics where motion is explored in real time through paneling and other techniques. Speaking of paneling, we're going to move on to the Florentine Baptistery. Mostly known for its intricately carved doors, we are going to talk about its ceiling. In this next picture, you can see the oddly truncated triangle shapes that make up the ceiling surrounding the tower. In this next drawing, we could see an example of how the stories are stacked upon one another with simple dividing lines to differentiate them. In this picture, you can see exactly what I'm talking about, with multiple stories and plot lines happening directly on top of each other. The most important part of this story is how their motion and the differentiating is happening, using panels. Paneling is very important. Paneling is the most essential and noticeable part of modern comics, and paneling is almost as much a part of comics as the actual drawings themselves. And that's not all. We even get to see sequential movement. As an explanation to why dividing lines were used at on the ceiling, I think it wasn't specifically used for paneling because paneling didn't really exist, but rather to divide the magnitude amount of stories, which shows attention to detail and plotline. In this next photo, we can see third down, middle panel, two knights are standing before a king, but in the next panel, they're kneeling before him. This is sequential movement, which is pretty advanced and very rare for this time period. In this next picture, we see that the dividing lines, though very decorative, were used to separate multiple stories as well as put more emphasis on sequential movements within the same scene. In previous frescoes, we've seen some motion, but primarily jumps to important scenes. In the Baptistery, we see the sequential movement throughout multiple stories, which puts emphasis on the actual storytelling. With paneling, sequential movement, and a plot line, I consider this to be a full-fledged comic strip. Now we just have to ask the question, could this be the first comic strip? Well, the Baptistery was finished in 1128 AD versus way before The Yellow Kid, a comic published in 1896, which is widely considered to be the first comic. Now we're left with philosophy. Does it have to be on paper? Does it need to include words? And does it have to be intentional? Really, who's to say what's a comic and what's art? These definitions are hard to explain and even harder to differentiate between. But in the end, we're left with beautiful storytelling, and there's no denying the format of the Baptistery has influenced modern comics. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and leave a comment or a question if you like. Thank you.